Hello and welcome to The Conscious Capitalists, hosted by two of the co-founders of the Conscious Capitalism movement and co-authors of the Conscious Capitalism Field Guide from Harvard Business Press, Raj Sisodia and Timothy Henry. Each week, this podcast covers current events and business news and Raj and Timothy's latest thinking on what it takes to build a conscious business. For more information and notes from the show, go to www.theconsciouscapitalists.com. And now, Raj and Timothy.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode number 34 of The Conscious Capitalists with myself, Timothy Henry, and my partner in making the world a better place through business, Raj Sisodia. Hi, Raj.
Hi, Timothy. Good morning.
So today we have a wonderful guest, Carolyn Taylor. Now, I've had the opportunity to work with Carolyn on a couple of occasions, and she is really, truly one of the world's foremost experts on the whole topic of culture and making culture change. She's the chairman or chairperson of a consultancy called Walking the Talk. She's written a book by the same name. Over the past 30 years, Carolyn's run workshops with over 200,000 leaders, worked alongside 200 culture change journeys, consulted on 15 mergers and acquisitions, coached 60 CEOs, and worked in 35 countries. She's known for facilitating events, and I can swear by this because I've been with her on some of these, with teams that are insightful, profound, fun, and provocative. In 2005, she wrote what is probably one of the definitive guides on culture change called Walking the Talk. And most recently, she's written a new book called Accountability. Now, Carolyn, maybe tell us a little bit about the new book, in particular, the journey that got you to this book on accountability. And why now?
I think the now answer was that it became particularly relevant with the whole lockdown pandemic situation, where people who were maybe struggling with really how to do accountability well, but struggled potentially even more when they weren't able to look over people's shoulders. So that gave a whole nother angle, although I had started writing it before the pandemic. The bigger reason was that finding that most leaders were wanting their people to perform more, whether that was financially perform more or be more urgent and quick in what they were delivering and so on. And many people feeling that they had goals imposed on them that they didn't really think were doable. And so it felt like somehow accountability had become somewhat old school, had got a bad name for itself. And I wanted to do something about that.
Well, I love that you start part of the book and part of the description of the book with this phrase, "You can count on me." And I love that idea that you bring in of that idea, you can count on me, and the difference between a promise and intention. And I particularly liked the part where you say when a partner calls and says, "I'm going to be home for dinner at 6:30, you're checking in. Is that a promise or is that an intention? Talk a little bit about that idea. You can count on me.
Well, you can count on me, and the other question, can I count on you? It's been the shorthand I've used for, and of course it's a play on the words accountability. Works well in English, doesn't work so well in other languages, but it's a great sort of shorthand for that interaction that happens between two people, because in my view, you can only be accountable when held to account. It's a particular relationship, and it's the quality of that relationship that really determines whether the outcome will happen. And that's really what the book is about, that it's having clear conversations, like you said, about, is this a promise or an intention? Am I going to put the spaghetti on, or am I going to, wait and, because then you'll in fact arrive back 30 minutes later because that was fine. It was only an intention. And that my partner and I both do that both ways, or we used to when we used to be out at work. So that idea has been very powerful. Promise versus intention, discovering that most leaders assume that the goals are a promise. Many people, when asked, what's the likelihood you think that this goal is going to be achieved, will say maybe 60-70%, which then maybe leads it into the intention realm. And then one goes, okay, the next question, of course, is what would it take to make it a promise? So it's a good conversation starter.
Well, you also bring up the idea of accountability and empowerment. And that's funny because sometimes when people talk about those, they sort of see them as, sort of like, if I'm empowering you, what does that really mean with regards to this idea of accountability? So maybe, explain, that you brought that up in the book as well. And I'd love to hear more about that.
And I think that goes to why accountability got a bad name, and now you have everything from, remote working to agile teams, and the whole concept that in fact people don't need supervision in that sense. So therefore, the whole role of what accountability is has to change. But I still believe that there needs to be some very clear conversations at the front end of what I'll call an accountability contract between two people, which says, what is it? What am I asking of you? What am I asking of this team? What am I asking of this project? And having got that really, really clear, and both parties feeling, one in particular feeling, I can say, I can give you my word, this is a promise. Then, of course, you allow real empowerment, because then everything else is then clear within that boundary. Without any sort of discussion like that, I think there's a risk that agility becomes abdication, actually, and chaos.
Yeah.
So that's been one of the things to explore in this whole process, I think, about what really is empowerment.
Well, it also leads to an interesting question about the quality of the dialogue that you and I are having. and can I have the tough conversation where I sort of say, no, it's my boss asking me to do something. Where's that line between sort of saying yes because I feel obliged to say it, and a true promise that comes from a commitment I'm making to you that's sort of freely given in a sense. Yeah. But that fine line between you're asking me to do something, therefore I have to do it, versus actually I'm making a commitment to you that I'll do it.
But just imagine, I mean, think how many times people you feel, even in, in your, anyone who's listening to this, where somebody actually really eyeballs you, even on Zoom, and says, you absolutely you can count on me for this, and what a different feeling that would be in terms of the confidence you then have someone will deliver. And that doesn't happen. That kind of commitment doesn't tend to happen. And I think it doesn't tend to happen because people don't have those conversations. People say yes for a whole lot of reasons. They say yes to please you. They say yes because they want to look, oh, I can do anything. Yes, of course I can say yes. Or they say yes to avoid conflict because they're fairly sure no one will follow up anyway. So yes is actually the easier thing to say. Having the real conversation is quite different. So what was fascinating is going into a topic of accountability and discovering that actually at its purest form, it is all about a really quality conversation between two people. And when you have the courage to have that up front, the likelihood that it then gets delivered on the way through, because when I really give you my word, when I feel like it was a promise, it changes what I do when things get difficult. Does that make sense? Because when something gets difficult, instead of going, well, it was a stupid goal anyway, and I never thought I was going to be able to do it, there's a much stronger thing which says, well, actually, I did give you my word. I mean, I had one just the other day when a colleague of mine, we of course we play with this language in my organization, Walking the Talk now, and we were playing around with that language of, she's going, so can I count on you to check this, because I got to do something with a client tomorrow. I, went out for the evening, came back really tired. And I remember there was a moment when I was about to go to bed where going, I promised Liz I would do this. And something changes inside of you where you go, okay, I have to get out of bed and do this now because I gave her my word. If she hadn't nailed me on that, had that conversation, for sure I wouldn't have done it. So that's a small example, but of course it plays, right up to annual goals, to, safety standards, to anything you want to apply it to.
Well, Carolyn, I'm sure in your experience, as in ours, most cultures are pretty dysfunctional. Would you agree?
Oh, yes.
And to me, the two dimensions that stand out, one is the idea of caring, how much caring is there in the culture, and then the idea of accountability. And often the two are somewhat out of balance. They're very caring-oriented cultures that have no accountability, really. And I think that was Bill George's experience when he came to Medtronic. So people were really nice to each other, but nobody kept their promises and things just didn't get done. Or you have the more common scenario of this whole emphasis on high performance and delivering the numbers and so forth. So it's all about the numbers and accountability, but really no caring behind it. And that burns people out, and the quality of results are not that great. So the question to me always is, how do you have both of these, not in diluted forms, but how you have a deep level of caring along with a high level of accountability? So how do you manage that, what seems like a polarity, that people go on one side or the other?
Well, I think you'll find that is, I've never thought of it in exactly the way you're describing it there. But I think that's actually what the book has been about, what my thinking has been about, is that when you have an adult to adult conversation, I mean, always, I in the book, I call them the asker and the giver. Right? There's one person who wants something and there's someone else who's giving. And that applies to boss, subordinate, it applies to peers, it applies to a supplier and customer, it applies to friends, any way you want to do it. The asker always wants more. I mean, almost by definition, I want more volume, less time, less cost, etc. I mean, that's kind of almost normal. And the giver has always got the doubts because they've got all these other things that are coming at them, and can I do it? So if you go into a conversation recognizing that there's going to be that natural tension, and in a way there should be that natural tension, I mean, that's kind of right and proper that the asker, can ask for a bit more, then I think it changes the dynamic about, we recognize there is a tension. How do we have the conversation in a caring way? It's not actually in the asker's interest to have a yes given and then it not delivered. So that's one of the big errors I think people make, is if I just push and tell, people will say yes. And then of course they blame the people when it doesn't get delivered. What I'm proposing is there are two roles, both have a responsibility here. Both, as you, in your words, both have responsibility to do this in a caring way and an adult conversation, and listen to what the doubts are. And the more you listen and hear what the doubts of the giver are, the more you can then go, okay, so what would it take, Timothy, your word, to change this from a promise, from an intention into a promise? And then what comes out, of course, are all the risks. Well, I think this won't happen. I'm worried this person won't deliver for me. I've got 5 other things on my plate, blah, blah, blah. And then you can go into, well, let's have a look at this. How can we resolve this? Or, so at least you've then got it all on the table. And I think that's how you can be caring and accountable at the same time. I mean, there are many other ways, but that would be one simple answer.
So I think it sounds like you're saying you start with deep listening and understand what's really going on below the surface, and listen for the emotions and the values underneath that, and then you come to a very, very clear agreement where there's no doubt about what we have agreed to. Right?
Exactly. And I think that the higher the quality of the discussion, the more likely, actually, because you will get to a point where the asker gets what they want and the giver feels that they've given a promise. I mean, that's the ideal scenario, right? That you can get to the point where both feel completely satisfied. The quality of the conversation is what determines that. And the more time you spend on that conversation, whether it's for something really simple, like my colleague doing the follow-up email saying, was that a promise or an intention, that you'll look at that report, right through to the more time you spend on that up front, the less time you then have to spend on the way through. And yet most organizations put most of their energy on the back end, the consequences, the reward system, that you think about, that's where the energy is, as opposed to putting the energy on the front end and those deeper conversations.
And in some cases it may not be an asker giver, it could be, you might be co-creating something, right? You're collaborating to do something within which you might have simultaneously two-way, I'm asking for this while I'm giving this, and so forth, right?
That's right. So both people are playing asker and giver even within the same piece of work, you mean? Yes, yeah, absolutely. Right. Yeah, that can also be the case. Mm-hmm. The same principle. In most cases, I find those conversations are easier, I think, in a way, than the ones where the asker is not actually playing an active role in doing the work. That tends to be where you get more of the us and them, where you end up with, when it goes wrong, the asker, each party blaming the other one, more often happens when you've got that. They are different roles in a way, but therefore, what I'm trying to explore is, I think there is a role of the asker both before a promise and after the promise, if that's the moment where you get the handshake, and then there's a role of the giver before and after, and that's what the book covers in pretty straightforward ways. It's one of those, it's not a tome; it's a short to the point. Here's some ways of doing it. But there's much more to it than it first looks. I mean, that's what fascinates me, because as we're starting to talk about now, on the one hand, it's a simple piece, but as I think all three of us know, we can say simple things, what does it take to have that quality of real conversation?
Yeah.
Takes us into a different, takes us to another level.
Well, I think it also plays, and you mentioned this in the book, that it also plays to the whole idea of trust and building a level of trust between people and inside an organization. And we often, say that trust is a critical part of a conscious culture, is there has to be high degrees of trust. And I thought it was fascinating that you point out that the quality of these dialogues actually leads to people making true commitments, making true promises, which of course then builds trust and builds more trust. So there's this interesting upward spiral that occurs. The more trust there is, the higher the quality of the dialogue we have, the more likely it is we'll make real promises and real commitments. We'll then follow through on them, which builds the trust and moves up and up. And I love that idea of an upward spiral that comes and over time develops trust. Because people sometimes say, well, how do you build trust in an organization? And part of it is, one person, one relationship at a time.
Yeah, well, I mean, reliability is one of the dimensions, isn't it, in the trust equation? Competence plus reliability plus intimacy divided by self-interest. So I mean, it certainly hits to the reliability element, but I think it also touches on the intimacy element, because you're starting to have a real relationship with people on this, and a relationship of equals rather than a relationship of, so that I think makes a big difference. It also makes it then when things do go wrong and when other circumstances do kick in and, what I thought was a promise becomes at risk, the likelihood of them being able to reopen that conversation in a really constructive way becomes very different. What are the trade-offs? What might have to be, is it more important now, given that this circumstances has happened? It's easy to say, well, COVID hit, well, this hit, well, the competitor changed their prices, well, whatever, all the justifications we give for why now something can't happen. I think if you've got that trust, that real relationship, the possibility of then going, well, given that, what might now we be able to do? It moves people into that ownership space, which has an impact on what then ends up getting delivered. But I think where you're heading, Timothy, and I agree with you, is that not only does it have an impact on that particular deliverable, but it has an impact on the trust issue.
Yeah.
And then, Raj, I mean, you raised the issue of culture, and if we take this broader, then, and the definition that we give on culture is that it is the patterns of behavior that get encouraged and discouraged and tolerated. So where this gets really interesting is to say, well, can this become a pattern of behavior? So can having this kind of conversation become the norm, become the pattern of behavior across a whole organization, whereupon it becomes a cultural norm to do this? And then, of course, the rising tide lifts all boats. The option then, the possibility then is that you lift everyone up to that kind of behavior. Then it gets really exciting.
I wanted to explore that a little more. So zooming out into your span of your work that you've done all these years, what's your general approach towards assessing a culture and then bringing about a transformation in the culture? I'm familiar with the Barrett approach, the Barrett cultural values.
Yeah.
So how do you come into a culture and evaluate it and then figure out what is the destination point and how do we get there?
So we, first of all, we make a difference between evaluation and measurement. I think they're two different things. I mean, in evaluation, we might call it diagnostic. I think there's a piece about really understanding not only what the culture is, but why it is that way. And we found that you need to do qualitative work to understand that. No matter how good your survey is, you're not going to get to the why. Certain patterns of behavior are there. So we have qualitative tools which we particularly use for them measuring change and understanding the difference between different demographic groups. Is this country culture different from that one over there? I mean, that's valuable for. But in terms of really understanding, because what we're always looking for, and we do it mostly by interviews and by focus groups, and then by really looking not only at what people say, but also what people don't say. because when you ask people, what matters around here, it becomes fascinating what they say and what they don't say. And, we count how many times different words get raised and so on. But what we're looking for there is not only what are the patterns of behavior, but also the beliefs that sit underneath those patterns of behavior. So what are the shared beliefs in an organization? So, if you want a job done well, do it yourself, for example, might be a belief that is common across a large part of an organization. We find those particularly common in organizations where they've grown up, like, for example, mining or something like where the tradition of the organization is people doing things in remote and difficult locations and learning how to make, do, and fix things themselves. And so almost deeply inherent in the culture is fix it yourself. So if you have that as a belief, then there are patterns of behavior that will sit over the top of that, like not collaborating and reinventing the wheel because I don't trust somebody else to do it for me, et cetera, which then becomes the culture. So we're looking for both, because if you can get to and we're always looking to see if we can expose the beliefs. Mm-hmm. Because if you find the beliefs, sometimes when you even just bring them out into the light, people go, oh, yeah, we do have that as a belief, and we hadn't even realized we had it as a belief, and it's probably not useful anymore. Now, some of them are more difficult to shift, but sometimes just even exposing them is a good start. So that would be the diagnostic plan. What we're looking for is what are the two or three things. We did a piece of work with an organization the other day who'd had some very major problems happen in the organization a couple of years before, real reputational risk issues going on. And what we found in the diagnostic was that the beliefs, the core patterns of belief, there was one about infallibility. We're too big to fail. We're, all that sort of stuff. And that hadn't actually changed. And it was that infallibility or the arrogance that had actually caused the first problem. And despite the fact that they'd done all the process improvements and all the things you wouldn't expect to do, they hadn't sifted that belief. And so the chances were that, it was going to happen again. So we're looking for the one or two things that if you pull that, if you can unravel that, it will change.
Well,
that's the first piece. Didn't get to the second piece about how, but we'll do that later. Timothy.
Well, that's sort of where I was about to go in a way. But I'm going to ask the how from a different point of view, which is so many times when I've gotten into questions or discussions about strategy and strategy execution, the question of culture comes up and the need to change a culture to fit with a new strategy or a new direction the business is going in. And, I wish I had like a pound note or a dollar note for every time I've heard, this is a culture issue, as sort of an excuse for why something's not happening or a strategy isn't getting executed. So I'm curious. Everybody wants to have a good cultural change. Nobody starts off saying, okay, we want to really mess up this cultural change. Yet, nonetheless, I'm sure in your experience, not with your clients, but with people that aren't your clients, you have observed a lot of efforts that haven't really worked out. And I'm curious, what do you look at and see as sort of the two or three top mistakes that senior leaders are making when they start saying, hey, we've got to have a culture change here. We've got to change our culture in order to, and, it's not like, executing a strategy where you sort of say, hey, we got to do these four things. When you go to change a culture, it's a little bit different. And I'm curious, what are those two or three lessons learned that you've observed? Okay.
So maybe three. So the first one would be confusing culture with engagement. So people can be very engaged and the culture can be damaging for your strategy. Either for reputational reasons. But there was no evidence, for example, that Volkswagen employees were not engaged, and yet there was cultural patterns of behavior about, the way that they were reporting emissions, which was a problem. So measurement of engagement is not a proxy for have I got the right culture for this future strategy. Having said that, if you develop the right strategy over time, then people will become engaged, but that's as a result of. Second thing around engagement then is, of course, that often I think people put a lot of effort into communicating the culture they want, and they get people excited about that. And then they say, we've got everybody on board now. And they see that as a proxy for it. So there's a big difference between people being on board with the culture that you want and people having visibly and objectively changed the patterns of behavior and the patterns of thinking that were needed for your new culture. And we're always encouraging, and that would be one. The second piece then would be, don't try and change everything. I think it's impossible to change an entire culture. Pick the one or two patterns of behavior that you really need for this new culture, so for this new strategy. So, you have a strategy, for example, which is going to be about managing global brands with consistency rather than local, So what you need then is a globally thinking organization who is prepared to adapt global standards and not reinvent them at every local location, even though it might have been better for the individual customer. You know that one, I'm sure. So that required, if that was your strategy, you then just focus on that bit of the culture. What is it going to take to change that mindset from local, in a sense, to global? So that would be the second thing, doing too much. And then the third thing, of course, is not walking your talk. I mean, not role modeling. That's the one most people would come. So coming out with these great statements, but then genuinely sometimes I think with senior leaders, not recognizing that they are not walking the talk. So for example, coming out with a great statement and then hiring a new employee from the outside who represents everything that you said you no longer value. So you say you want to become customer centric, you then hire somebody who is an amazing salesperson, but doesn't really care about the customer and will sell whatever product they need to get, to meet the numbers in this month. Yeah. So it's the decisions, the symbols that leaders make, and we find a lot of our role is actually holding up the mirror. Our teams observe ordinary meetings, hold up the mirror and say, you said you wanted this, but in this meeting, there were 5 examples where you did the opposite of that. And that will go up. People go out and talk about it. Yeah. So they're not serious. They think you're not serious.
Well, I want to draw a funny parallel here. Well, I mean, it's not a funny parallel, but I want to draw a parallel here between when people come to me and they sort of say, listen, I want to get involved in a leadership development program and I want to be a great leader. And, I sort of say, well, let's talk about what a quote unquote great leader is, but let's also talk about where you are at and how you can be a little bit better. So I never make the promise, or I try to make sure the organization I'm with never makes the promise that we're going to create great leaders. We're going to make the leaders we've got be a little bit better. And I bring this up in the context of cultures and sort of people saying, hey, I want a great place to work kind of culture. And the culture being where it is right now. And your view, and how do you talk with a client when a client comes and says, I want to have a great culture? And you're sitting there going, let me see, my initial observations is that you're over here. How do I break this to you gently? Or how do you handle that kind of dialogue around, I want a great culture? Like who doesn't want a great culture?
Well, given how much it actually takes to change a culture, and that I think is an emerging understanding, organizations invest hundreds of millions of dollars in changing the patterns of behavior in their customers, but they're unwilling to invest in what it actually takes, how much it actually takes to change the patterns of thinking and behavior in their employees. And yet we're talking about the same thing. There's a belief that, so given that it really is a serious investment, I find that it's a better option to link it not just to we want a great culture because therefore everybody will want to work for us, although that is one of the outcomes, but sure, to link it, as you said before, about we want a great culture because it will help us implement our strategy. So that would be the first thing that I would suggest. And then, define great. I mean, there are without doubt a couple of elements that can make it a great place to work. But then, Raj was talking before about, organizations that are nice places to work, but are not successful. So, the people who are happy with in that nice place to work might not be happy in another organization that is more hard-nosed and more performance-orientated. Other people might be. So you can judge a culture, I think, by who it's ejecting, who's choosing to leave, and who is being asked to leave tells you a lot about what is valued. So you really want a fit for purpose culture, which is a bit different.
As you say that, I mean, so one of the things that we've struggled with is people will, we talk in conscious capitalism that one of our 4 pillars is, of course, having a conscious culture. And in the book that Raj and I co-authored, we said that we don't know about the values. There's a question about which values you want to, but the outcome that we want or that we defined, we used, Raj is always really good with coming up with these little phrases. So he came up with the phrase tactile. We want trust, authenticity, caring, transparency, integrity, learning, and empowerment as sort of, these are outcomes of a conscious culture. And I'm wondering, do you in your mind somewhere have an idea about what a really conscious culture looks like to you as sort of, a place where you'd ideally like to see companies moving towards?
Well, I tend to start with the word conscious. So for me, being conscious means being awake or aware and able to watch. There's an element of yourself witnessing, if you like, that is able to watch yourself behave and potentially then choose a different behavior, either during, before, or even after for next time, but being sufficiently conscious that you can see your own patterns of behavior and you can see your own contribution to a dynamic with somebody else, a conflict or whatever. And so, my background originally was in the consciousness movement in my early life. When I used to teach meditation, we were looking at the levels of adult development, as it's now referred to, then was called levels of consciousness. And what does that mean? So if you think about all the things we're talking about, picking any one of those: authenticity, transparency, learning. Let's take learning, for example. To be a learner requires humility. It requires curiosity. It requires the admission that I'm not always right. And if you then think about some of those more conventional, pre-conventional type mental patterns of thinking, which are about the world is against me, I have to defend myself, I've always got to look good. If I have that as a pattern of thinking, as a worldview, which is unless I always look good, someone's going to come and usurp me, then it's going to be very difficult for me to become a learner, because becoming a learner would have to admit making mistakes, not being perfect, humble, and so on. So that's how I see consciousness is the state of development of the human being that is required to move towards those 7 things that you have there, or many others as well, because there are so many patterns. You talk. Or so many other patterns of behavior that come from a defensive mechanism and that limited worldview. And unless one can shift that, and that's where I get excited about, is it possible to in fact accelerate human development in the name of developing the right culture, in the name of developing more conscious organizations and a better world?
Well, Carolyn, that raises the issue around different subcultures that exist within organizations. Typically a big divide between the blue collar and white collar parts of the organization, the full-time college educated managerial part of the company, and then the people who are actually doing the work at the front lines, whether it's a factory or whether it's a service establishment or whatever it might be. And we found dramatic differences between levels of engagement, levels of sense of purpose, being cared for, having an opportunity to grow and develop and evolve. That there's a kind of caste system that exists in many companies. What has been your observation about that, and how do you think we can that?
I'd love to have a longer conversation about what differences you found, because I mean, what I have found has been that human beings in the end are human beings. So I think there are certain traits, such as the need to look good, the need to be in control, just as a couple, the need for relationship, the need to feel wanted, which I think are universal. I think they play out differently to some extent in different roles, in blue collar, we would say blue collar, but senior or less senior, certainly. But I don't find the human being as being different. So I don't, for example, we haven't found less interest in, when given the opportunity, we have found the same level of desire or openness to the possibility of becoming more conscious based on that definition I gave before at any level of the organization. And sometimes actually in more senior levels, there is more to lose. And so actually the journey is more difficult. So I don't know if that's your experience, Raj. So in some respects, it's harder to work with more senior leaders than it is to work with people. I mean, it's very different. You've got to be much more practical. You can't waffle on with great long theories and concepts, and there's all that sort of stuff. I mean, I grew up in Australia where they definitely called a spade if you started to do any of that rubbish. However, when you got past that and you got the practicalities, I have found both to be highly open. But fascinated in your view on that.
Well, no, I agree with you. People are people, and they happen to be playing different roles. I think it's from the other side. Most organizations do not prioritize that, and they only make available these kinds of opportunities to certain people. So the book that I wrote called Everybody Matters, the title itself tells you it really started with Everybody Matters. It's people at the shop floor in the manufacturing company, right? And that's an exception, I believe, to the norm. In many other companies, some people matter. We say these are the high potentials, right? And they're going to get all these opportunities. Or our programs only go to a certain level within the organization, and we really don't pay attention. So the rest of the people are simply doers, and we just tell them what to do, and we don't really care much more.
Yeah.
I think that's the divide that I'm looking to see. How do we do?
And I think that goes then to the investment. Actually, funnily enough, back to the investment piece I was saying before, because there is a skill involved, I think, in helping an individual to grow and to develop from the point of view of adult development, and developing a sense of developing from that level of consciousness and expanding their worldview. That is not something that you can put somebody who has been running safety training for 10 years in and say, okay, put people through a program and they're going to, it is a skilled profession. And to be honest, because we're searching for people all the time who can do it, there are not that many people who are able to do that work. And so I think our limitation is, how do you, on the assumption that it is possible, which I am now completely convinced that it is possible, that people who were completely defensive can open up to other possibilities with the right interventions. And obviously, in our case, the interventions cost money. Now, if you say it gets very expensive to do that kind of intervention right through an organization, and I was saying before about how much are people prepared to invest compared to what they would invest in, changing the behavior of their customers. And you go, okay, how do we, and I won't say, because I think all three of us are in this same game, how do we train enough people who can do that work? Because if there were enough people who knew how to do that work and take it deeply into organizations, whether they were external consultants or internal HR people or whatever they happen to be, at a price that could be afforded, I genuinely think that we could create transformations not only in organizations, but frankly in the world. I mean, I would like to see that same work being done in schools and universities. And, it is a body of work, and it is chronically undervalued relative to the academic sphere or the technical sphere of development. It's changing now, but nowhere near fast enough. And the other question is whether or not one can take people to those kind of places if you haven't been there yourself. So, for example, we teach something about, we call it above and below the line. It's about whether you blame other people or whether you take responsibility. If you're living a life of blame, you can't teach that work. You can't. Because when people go into wonderful justifications about why everything is has got to stay the way that it is and it's not their fault anyway, you don't hear it for what it is, which is a mental model which is being applied to the world. And so you can't call someone on it. You can't help someone through it. So I think that's a challenge we've all got to face.
I want to build on that a little bit. I mean, we've been blessed by having a couple of wonderful speakers recently on our show talking about, living wages, talking about the fact that, 2/3 of American workers have less than, $1,000 in savings. And when you're talking about those kind of numbers, and you're talking about consciousness, and you really go to your frontline people, they're on this thin line between survival and, just making a living. And then we get into a sort of a higher order of, are you doing meaningful work? Do you feel cared for? Are you making commitments? And it seems to me that part of my own bias, I think many of practitioners' bias, is that we're biased towards those white collar workers and trying to make the culture better with them. And forgetting that for some of the real frontline people, they're coming at it from a point of view where they're on a knife's edge sometimes around this whole idea of feeling economically safe in the world. And so, looking at Maslow's hierarchy of needs,
I was just about to say Maslow.
You're at a very different level. So I'm curious about how that plays out in culture change in your world.
Maslow was what came to mind there. Is it possible to even consider these things when you are in a fear that is driven by economic reality, as opposed to a fear of some of the other fears that I was talking about before? And we all know when we are highly stressed or very ill or any of those conditions which put us under stress, how hard it is to then be able to step back and see a different, to see a bigger solution, to be able to step and have that helicopter view sometimes. So it is extremely difficult when you're in that situation. And I mean, there's a couple of ways that I would take this. In an ideal world, the belief, forming the belief, one of the most damaging things, I think, is the belief that I can't lose my job. Because when I feel I can't lose my job, then a lot of these patterns that we've been talking about over the last little while, I have to please the boss. I can't afford to say no, or I feel like I'd say, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so when someone is in that position, whether it is possible to reach the point where I go, I know I'd be okay. When, all the evidence is saying maybe I wouldn't be okay, is not an easy place to get to. Now, I have absolutely worked with people who have got to that place of say, I know I will be okay. And guess what? Most people actually are okay when the worst happens, but one doesn't know that that's going to happen. And what okay means is got, so you're stepping on the most delicate place in terms of then saying to people, can you find that place inside where it would be okay? And it's almost like I almost don't dare say it, because it's almost like it sounds like an uncaring thing to say. And yet it is also liberating. So we go there a little way, and we also go on the more practical level on a lot of what we're working with here. A lot of the techniques we're showing people will actually help them to become better at doing their job. So we were talking accountability before. If I get better at being 100% reliable and always just doing what I said I will do, that means I am more likely to keep my job if there were a situation where jobs were going to be lost. So some of it is, we've gone to several levels here, but at the most practical level, I would try there.
Well, Carolyn, you mentioned that you grew up in Australia. I would love to learn more about your journey and how you came to do the work that you do. Did you have some awakenings along the way? Were there some epiphanies, some turning points in your life? Share a little bit of your journey with the life story with us.
Big epiphanies, major journey points, indeed. Yes. I actually grew up in England. And I, as a young adult with small children, I had my children very young. My first work was teaching meditation. I got involved in the Transcendental Meditation Organization way back, like way back, the back end of the hippies, and ended up running a meditation organization in the UK where we used to have thousands of people and a guru, and we did the whole meditation piece. And
what drew you to that? Just back up a little.
Oh, one of those completely random things. A neighbor who was doing it and said, "Come along one evening." I can't pretend to be anything more profound than that. But then, of course, having done it, profound impact on a whole range of different things: health, well-being. I'm sure that you and many readers will know of those. So I became a very rapid convert. And back then, there was a lot of research going on the impact the meditation had on the whole range of benefits. And so I got heavily involved in that. And I was actually flown out to Australia by a couple called Walter and Geeta Bellin, who had run this meditation organization I was in, and they were starting something in Australia. I went over there. They were looking for people who were able to stand in front of large groups and teach, which I'd by this stage discovered I could do. I was in my 20s then. And then worked with them for a couple of years. They had then done some of the work on personal development, the work that was coming out of California on personal development, Werner Erhard and so on. And they put together a combination of meditation and personal development. So we had long arguments about, was meditation enough, or did you actually really have to look at the patterns of behavior and the patterns of thinking, and came to the conclusion you did. So we used to run amazing courses for people in personal development. And then I became so convinced that this work was of value. I felt that people who came and spent $500 to come for a weekend, in a sense, were already halfway there. And I wanted to reach people who would never do a course like that. I mean, the sort of people we were talking about before, just ordinary people with difficult lives and not much money and an ordinary job. And it just felt like that sort of stuff wouldn't be exposed to them. And so I remember we sat down one day and said, how could we do that? How could we take this incredibly valuable information and insight and transformation of people that we had seen to a much larger group? And we said it would have to be either through education system or through business. And somebody had been on one of the programs who ran an advertising agency. We went to talk to him. We said, this is what we were thinking of doing. This is my husband and I. And he said, oh, why don't you come and work for our agency? And we could, have a thing which was the external promise of the brand, the internal promise of, what we later called culture. At that stage, we weren't calling it culture. People didn't even have values in those days. We called the company corporate vision. Vision and corporate weren't words that were combined, and corporates didn't have visions in those days. And we started from there. So it was, partly serendipity, partly a belief that this work matters. And we learned so much, obviously, in the corporate world. We learned that when people haven't chosen and paid to come on a program, you don't have the same permission as when they have. But this was a long time ago now, 30 years ago, and I've been doing it ever since. And we were hugely successful. And the woman who actually brought me out to Australia, Geeta Bellin, then later on worked with Michael Rennie, who started when McKinsey got into some of this work. She went to work for McKinsey to do that work. So we were involved sort of in the very, very early days, and McKinsey actually poached a few of the people who we had in our organization to start their work back in the 90s, which started in Australia. And it kind of went from there. And then I read my book, and that took me back globally, and it's just been a lifetime's mission.
Mm.
I know a guy named Rob Malik from Australia. He was
I know Rob. Yes,
I
know Rob. Yeah, he was in the McKinsey piece. Yeah, So yeah, and then what I realized is that there are so many people across the world who are seeking to help on this level now. And like I said before, transformational facilitators, whatever we want to call ourselves, in organizations, out of organizations, writing, we're all trying. I am confident. I am quietly confident that the result of the work that is happening with all of us is over time going to change the patterns of behavior in society. Now, I know sometimes it feels like we go backwards, you know, and you can see sort of the opposite happening, but I guess I am an optimist. And I mean, if I think in the corporate world when I started off, and, you know, the behaviors that you saw then compared to where we are now, you know, it's only been, what, 25, 30 years. I mean, you know, you probably have some of those early experiences. It's happening. I think it's happening really fast. Although I know other people don't think it's happening fast enough. But I remember standing up, facilitating in front of groups. You know, usually I was the only woman, of course, but also everyone had, you know, an ashtray and packets of cigarettes around them. And, you know, I would be smoking from the front. And I mean, life's changed, you know, in my lifetime. So I feel, yeah, for a long time, I was the only woman amongst men. I am encouraged as to where we're heading.
Yeah, so I wanted to just go further on that. So looking at the bigger picture of the world of capitalism and business generally and philosophy around that, our movement, stakeholder capitalism, includes all of these various conversations that are happening. Do you feel encouraged about where we are headed in the future? Because you've got that on the one hand, and then you have all these anti-capitalist, populist movements, uprisings, you know, flirtations with socialism and so forth happening on the other side. And I think maybe that's a warning signal that unless we reform, society could go down a very dark pathway. So overall, do you feel encouraged about that? Do you think we're going to change rapidly enough in the right directions?
I focus my work on the change at the individual level. So I won't comment on the political scene, but what I will comment on is if I think about something, for example, like sustainability and the environment, the need to think longer term. I mean, we were talking before about self-interest. We go back to human beings are human beings. The worldview that is needed to think beyond what's going to happen next week, and whether that is in from a shareholder capital, you know, making this quarter's profit, or whether it's decisions that we're going to make about whether we're going to pollute for the next generation. Both of those require the ability to have a longer term view and to think on behalf of the next generation as well as our own, or even 5 years out from an organizational perspective. I've always found it so much easier to work with privately owned organizations because they instinctively are able to think longer term. So I do believe that it may be that the kind of crises that we're hitting will force more of that thinking. That may happen. It may not happen. If it doesn't happen, we probably will all end up in a bad way. But that's why I link it to being conscious, because I think being conscious, one of the definitions of the more developed worldview is the ability to think longer term and the ability to see patterns that go beyond my own self-interest. So I think one has to start by trying to put those kind of leaders in place. But, they may not all get elected, and we all know that doesn't always happen. So I might be wrong. We may not make it.
Well, I think that you've raised a number of very interesting points, Carolyn, and one of them that comes back to this, if you're thinking longer term, then you're much more likely to invest in your people as a critical capability inside the organization. And I think that it goes to a point that, frankly, our accounting systems today view people as costs, and we're not capturing the idea that this is a capability, this is an important asset within the organization, and we ought to invest in this asset to make sure. And I don't like that word, to call people assets, but with the mind frame of, costs versus investment, if you have more of that long-term point of view, then I think you're in the end much more likely to make those kind of investments into your people, and therefore start to create the kind of organization that we're all talking about and hoping for here.
Wouldn't it be amazing, just to add to that before you respond, Carolyn, what if we took 10% of the hours that our people spend with us? Out of 40 hours, we just take 4 hours. And those 4 hours are devoted to personal growth and personal development and learning how to be a more effective not only human at work, but also everything that we do helps you in your personal life as well. So it's just shifting a little bit of that time, right? And then enabling people to invest in that kind of development and growth. I mean, I can imagine the returns from that would be extraordinary.
Oh, and you're both bringing up so many points. I don't even know where to start as well. This is a fantastic conversation because I would go beyond even investing in our people, Timothy. I would say we have to invest in our culture. Now, you would expect me to say that, but the reason I say that is because I'm not certain that believing that we should hold on to our people in this organization is actually the right outcome. So if you move to the possibility that people want to move around, then the reason culture matters is if you build the right culture, then you can bring anybody into it and they immediately lift up to the level of that culture. So the culture is actually even bigger than investing in the people, because if you invest in the people only, then the people move on and then the new people come in. But if you invest in the culture, so you have certain patterns of thinking and behavior within the norm in the organization, then you don't mind so much that your people move on. Yeah. You allow them, you welcome the fact that they want to move on, not because you were a bad place to work, but because that maybe is the way of the future. That's the way that we all think. So that would be one thing I would say there. But absolutely, if we invested in this, and part of investing in the culture, of course, is investing in your people. So it's not like the two are separate, right. But there are a few additional things you have to do to invest in a culture, which is beyond just investing in each individual. And one of them, actually, Timothy, where you go to, we have to change the accounting system. I mean, so when we look at culture, and Raj, you asked me this question a long way back and I didn't answer it, but how do you then go about changing culture? We look at the behaviors, the symbols and the systems, which all send messages of how people are expected to behave. I think we've talked a lot about the behavior. So I look at my role modeling, I'm seeing how everyone else is behaving. We talked a little bit about symbols in terms of the decisions I make, who I recruit, how much time a symbol would be 10%, putting 10% of our people investing on people would be a symbol that we really did care. But the other one is the systems, which is where you were moving to, Timothy, which is, in order to create different behavior, we need to start measuring different things. We need to account for things differently. We need to reward things differently. So all the financial systems and the HR systems in particular, probably the CFO and the CHO, I think CHRO have an equal impact on culture in terms of the systems. And that's true of society as well as true of an organization. Normally we find that once the owners of the systems really get the extent to which their system is shaping the behavior and the thinking, which they all are, and when they choose to change those systems, I don't have the expertise on how you change those systems, but when they choose to say, okay, I'm now going to change, just even in a really simple one, you can be, you measure product profitability and you change that to start measuring lifetime customer profitability, you are going to shape different behaviors. That's even at a product versus customer. That's not even going to a higher level of culture. It's just a different culture. So the same would be, I don't know the answer. What sort of an accounting system would you need to measure? What sort of, people are doing that thinking. I don't have the answer, but I know people are doing that thinking and it needs to be done. So behaviors, symbols and systems, you've got to tackle all three when you want to change culture.
Carolyn, thank you for your wisdom and your plethora of examples and knowledge you brought to the table today. I love the way you just summarized it in terms of the behaviors, the role modeling, and the systems really being critically important to being able to make these things work. So thank you for your presence today. We really appreciated it.
Thank you. It was great to be with you both.
And for you, our listeners, thank you for joining us this week. And if you've enjoyed this podcast, then whatever channel you're listening on, please hit the subscription button. And if you feel so moved, please go over to the Apple Podcast or to Spotify and, leave us a rating and leave us some notes if you enjoyed it. And if you want to leave a message for Raj and I, please go to our website, theconsciouscapitalists.com. And we have an area on the website where you can leave us a message. And Raj, if people want to know more about conscious capitalism, where can they go for that?
Well, they can certainly go to our book, the Field Guide, Conscious Capitalism Field Guide, other books that we have on the subject, and consciouscapitalism.org, which is the website for the nonprofit that is shepherding this movement. And we have chapters in about 20 countries and 40 or so US cities. So you may find a community nearby, or you can eventually start one on your own.
And Carolyn, if they want to know more about you and the work that you're doing, what's the best way for people to find out more about you and walk the talk?
Well, the company is called walkingthetalk.com. So that's where we do our work on changing culture. If you'd like to buy the book, Walking Your Talk, the original book on culture, or my new book, Accountability at Work, they're on Amazon. They're everywhere now. If you want to buy larger numbers for your teams, let us know. We can probably do a bulk book buy for you.
Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you, listeners. Until next week, we'll see you then.